In this video, we're going to talk about parallel routes in NextJs 14 in the app router. Now, parallel routing allows you to simultaneously render multiple pages in the same layout, actually also in the same segment. So what does this mean? Let me actually go through this example here, then we're going to look at some diagrams together. Now here, for example, we are simultaneously rendering the team and the analytics page. This is from the documentation, so kudos to the team for preparing these nice diagrams on the documentation. I'm going to include a link in the description if you wanted to have a further reading on the docs. But nonetheless, as you can see here, inside of our homepage, we are rendering two different pages, one be the team and one be the analytics, all using the same layout and the same segment. So they're all living at our homepage. Let's also contrast this with how, or backtrack to how NextJS actually works. So look at this diagram. Generally speaking, you would expose a segment publicly by including a page.jsx inside a folder. So for example, here inside my app router, I have this outermost layout. This is my root layout. I have my page.jsx. This is representing my homepage. So this is representing the / here. And then if I want to have different segments, I'm going to include folders like account. And if I put a page.jsx inside of this folder, it is going to make this segment publicly accessible, or this page.jsx is responsible for rendering the UI for this specific segment. Now again, to backtrack, this is what I mean by segment. Anything that comes after your domain, it is the path, and these segments are delimited by this /. So these are two different segments, account and settings, and then you have the path, which is followed by your domain, or it is what follows the domain. Now each of these segments are represented by a folder, and then you would include the UI by exporting a page.jsx from them. Okay. Now, if you want to actually render multiple pages on the same segment using the same layout, you're going to use the parallel routes. The way you would do it is that instead of having the folder name just be a regular folder name, like here account, you're going to create slots or add this @ sign in the beginning of the folder name, which makes this a slot, which then is not going to affect the URL. It is going to point at the same URL as the segment before it, or the higher level segment. And then you can export a page.jsx from it to actually render UI for this specific slot. So here in this example, we have the app router or the app directory. These are the outermost layouts and page pointing to our home page. Now I have two slots. One is the @team and the other one is @dashboard. And I am exporting page.jsx from both of them. These are again different pages, different UIs for these two slots. But both of these two slots are also mapped to our homepage, mapped to our /. So they're not creating a new segment inside of our path. Now going back to this diagram, the way that this now works is if you look at here to our root layout, we receive the props. Typically in the NextJS app, you would see children here, and this is going to be your pages and nested layouts passed into this layout. Now on top of the children prop, we're going to also get this slots. So props.team and props.analytics. These are two different pages that they're all provided to your higher level layout as props. Now, it's good to know that children is also actually an implicit slot. So let me just show you what I mean. Come down in this convention. Quick note here that the children prop is also an implicit slot that does not need to be mapped to a folder. What does this mean? Well, app page.js or JSX is equivalent to app /@children. If you can see here, it's as if this @children was already there. It's a slot called @children, which is responsible for rendering whatever you pass in as a children to this component. But you can expand this by also passing in other named slot by providing folders and creating an @ sign on top of them. We're going to jump into the code and actually see this in action. So don't worry if it doesn't make sense now. Maybe when we write code, you would understand. We're going to build an application like this one, where we have this main page, which says parallel route, and then we have the team page and the dashboard page actually rendered side by side. So these are three different pages that are just shown inside of our homepage. We're going to then expand it to also have a settings page, which is also inside of this specific slot there. So let's continue on with our notes here, and then we're going to jump into the code. Now you might wonder, why would you want to use these different pages at the same segment? You can definitely accomplish this by having your own server components. This just makes it easier for you to have different slots, to have different or separate your code for the UI for these different pages. Maybe when you are having highly dynamic sections in an app, such as a dashboard or feeds on a social site, you can have different pages, different components responsible for rendering different segments of your page. And the good thing about it is that it allows you to render independent error and loading states for each of these routes. So just like any other folder, you can have loading.jsx or error.jsx inside of these folders to then render loading UI or error boundaries for each of these slots. So it makes your code separate and manageable in that sense. It also allows you to conditionally render slots based on certain conditions. For example, you can have an auth login modal, or if you're on the dashboard and the user is logged in, they can see the dashboard. If they're not, they can see the login page. If they're logged in and if they are an admin, they can see a different page. So you can have conditional renderers or conditional pages on the same segment, on the same layout, without having to push them to a different page to see that specific section of your site. Now, the convention, as we talked about, is to create folders with the @ in the beginning. And just like I said, slots are not route segments, so they do not affect the URL structure. Therefore, in this case, @team /members would be accessible at /members. Again, as an example here, we have this file structure that defines two explicit slots, analytics and teams. You could see inside the app router, we have the analytics, the team, and then page.jsx from each one of the slots. And they're all accessible at / or our homepage. Now, again, our layout or the root layout is in this example is going to receive this children, analytics, and team slots on top of the children, so you can render them side by side. And again, this children is just an implicit slot that you don't have to map it. It's just mapped automatically for you. Now, before jumping into the code, I also want to talk about this unmatched routes. Now, in this example that you can see here, we have the team slot, we have the analytics slot, but inside of our team, we have this settings folder, which is a folder and not a slot. So this is going to create a /settings segment. But the analytics segment or analytics slot doesn't have that settings. So when we are at our homepage, all of these team and analytics slots are going to be passed into the layout and rendered side by side with our homepage. But when we move to /settings, this slot has a page, has a UI to render, but the other two don't. Now, this is where this default.js comes into play. And when you move to /settings, what NextJS is going to render depends on whether or not you have the default.js files for the other segments and your root segment, as you can see down here. And also it depends on whether it's a hard reload, meaning that somebody just punch in this URL to visit it for the first time, to go to /settings, or they're refreshing the page, or is it a soft navigation using next link to go to /settings? If it is the soft navigation using the link, the only thing that's going to get changed is this segment. So this slot is going to render the UI for the settings segment. The analytics and the homepage segments or sections are going to remain the same. So the only thing changing is that settings. But if you hard reload, NextJS will try to render the default JS first if they do have anything. And if there is no default JS for other slots inside of this segment, it's going to render a 404. Again, we're going to see this in action. Let me also show you this in the diagram here. So in this example, I have the team slot and the dashboard slot. And inside of my team, I have the about segment with a page inside of it. So this is mapped to about. But when we want to go to the about, the dashboard doesn't have this about segment. Our homepage is just homepage, so it's mapping to / doesn't have the about. So it's going to 404 if we reload this page to / about. But if we just soft navigate to about, the homepage and this dashboard section remains the same. So they're they would just maintain their previously active state. And the only thing changing is this UI here for this / about section or segment. Again, you can have default.js here to render a default when NextJS is not able to find the specific slot or the active slot for this specific segment. So let's just jump right into the code and see this in action. Maybe makes more sense when we see it in the code. So I've started with a brand new NextJS app that's using TypeScript and Tailwind. And the only thing that I have done is to add this headers component. We're going to come back to it later on. And a delay function in my lib folder to delay a promise when we wanted to add loading UI to these different segments and slots. We're going to use this function. Now inside of my app router, let's start from the root layout. Now inside here, I'm just rendering this children inside of this section. And then my main page, which is actually rendering this parallel routes div over here, it's just rendering this square with some paddings and background colors. And this is my home page or the children that I'm passing in to my root layout. Now I'm using this delay function to delay this render by 1,000 milliseconds or 1 second. This is useful when we are actually adding loading UI to see this in action. But this is where you would implement your data fetching. I'm just trying to simulate an asynchronous task of data fetching by this delay function. So let's start by creating our first slot. So we're going to include a folder called @team, and inside of it I'm going to include a page.tsx. Let me just copy some code. So inside of here I have this team page, and all I'm doing is a similar kind of square box with a team on it. Okay, so let's also create another slot, not inside of this but inside the app folder. I'm going to call this dashboard, and then I'm going to include a page.tsx inside of it. Let me copy some code. So again, here we're rendering the dashboard, a div that says dashboard. So we have created two different slots. Let me just make this a bit bigger. I have two different slots right inside of the app router, and I have included a page.tsx in each of them, responsible for rendering their UI for this specific slot. Now let's go back to our root layout and actually get these two slots here. So where we have the children, we're now going to get the team slot as well as the dashboard. Okay, and then let's also type them here. So this is going to be a team. It's again a React node and dashboard. Let me just bring in these two slots side by side, the children. So I have that section that renders the children up top, and then I'm going to bring the team and dashboard in a separate section down here in a Flex container to show them side by side. So let's refresh the page here. You can see the team and the dashboard page being rendered simultaneously or in parallel inside of our home page. Now, as I mentioned, the benefit here is that we can have separate codes that are responsible for fetching their own independent data that we are trying to simulate with this delay functions. But we can also have loading UI or error boundaries per this slot. So let's just go ahead and add some loading UI to our app, I'm going to start by adding a loading.tsx to our main app folder. This is just going to be that same box, but having some animation happening down here. Now this loading is now acting as the loading UI for all of these slots. As you could see, we had it up top, but we're also using this loading UI, but we can have their own specific loading UIs here. So let me create a loading UI for our team TSX, and let me just copy some code. So now we have a different or a specific loading UI for our team slot. We can do the same thing for the dashboard by creating a loading.tsx inside of this folder. And then now we're going to have a specific loading UI for our dashboard. As you can see here, they take some time. If you pay attention, if I refresh, we're going to get that. And then this guy is loading after 3 seconds and that guy is loading after 5 seconds. So this is just to show that these are independent pages that can fetch their own specific data. They can have their own loading UIs and error boundaries as separate components and separate pages that allows you to render them simultaneously side by side or conditionally one or the other depending on your use case. Now the last thing that I want to talk about is the use of the default JS, or when one of these slots or one of these parallel routes actually has a segment inside of it. So let's say inside of this dashboard, we have a segment called settings. And inside of it, we can define a page.tsx. Let's say we just have a div that says settings. And this is again simulating some data fetching inside of our settings page. Now, to be able to show a soft navigation when we want to go to this specific segment /settings, let's actually bring in that header component that we had earlier on to our root layout. So let's go to the app, to the root layout. And now here up top, I want to just bring in this header component that I have created, which is basically links. So let's go to this header component so we know what we're doing here. Now inside of this header component, I'm just rendering next links to home and /settings. Okay. So now if I go ahead to /settings and I'm clicking on the settings, the only thing that changes here is this specific dashboard slot that had that segment inside of it. Now these two, even though they do not have this specific segment inside of them, they're just going to render or match the current URL or render their previously active state. So nothing happens. If you just do a soft navigation, this segment that actually has this slot that actually has this segment is going to render that segment. Now this is different if I now refresh the page, which is a reload or a hard navigation. So let's see what happens if I'm on the /settings and I try to refresh. I'm going to get a 404. This is because NextJS cannot find the default.js files for this two specific slot and inside of our homepage. So let's go ahead and for this team actually create a default.tsx. Let's copy some code here. So all we're doing is that now this time instead of team, I say default team, and we also need a default.js inside of the outermost app router. So again, default.tsx. Again here, instead of the parallel route, I just say the default main page. So now let me just close all of this. If I go back to home and refresh my app here. So in the beginning, what we are seeing here is the main page, the team section and the dashboard section. This is the home page. If I now navigate to /settings, the only thing that changes is the settings segment inside of this slot. But now while I'm on the settings page, if I go ahead and refresh the page, we still see the 404, which shouldn't be the case. Now, for some reason, this doesn't work the way that it is supposed to work on local development. So when you're running your local server, the way that this hot module reload or the caching works actually interferes with this default.tsx inside of your root layout. But when you deploy your application, this actually works. So this is the deployed version of this same project. Now, if I'm on the home page, I can see the parallel route, the team, and the dashboard pages side by side. If I soft navigate to the settings, this is the only thing that changes. Again, What renders from Next.js depends on your folder structure and how you're navigating to this / settings. Now, while on the / settings, if I now refresh the page, so do a hard reload, you can see the default for my main page and the default theme is rendered. These are picked up from the default.js, and because I have those two files, it is not showing me a 404, whereas if I didn't have this default.js inside of my slots or inside the app router, inside the outermost root layout, it is going to show you a 404. But because I do have the default now added to my project, it shows the default for these two segments and the setting, which is the segment that already exists inside of our dashboard slot for this one. Now, if you go back, now that you have this result cached, if you go back to the home page, it shows the regular pages. If you go to the settings, it now defaults to this default theme page here and then renders that settings. So again, it works side by side with the cache. So therefore, depending on how you're navigating to this page, different stuff is going to get rendered. And that's a wrap for parallel routes in the app router in Next.js 14. They allow you to render multiple pages simultaneously at the same segment and using the same layout. Now, in a future video, I'll also cover intercepting routes, which is another Next.js advanced routing technique or concept. And then hopefully we're going to combine them together to create cool UIs like modals using parallel routes and intercepting routes. Now, if you have any questions, like always, hit me up in the comments and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.